this particular event is sponsored by the Shine Faculty Development Committee. And if we were at our annual meeting, this would be one of the things that you go to and choose early morning. So the lovely, delightful thing here is it's noon, and we didn't have to go anywhere or find parking. We can learn together in this setting. So let me go ahead, Bob, and introduce you a little bit about who you are.
Just a little bit.
Other than my neighbor.
Yeah, just exactly right. We
With
found
a
out
cute
we're neighbors
dog.
just a couple of weeks ago. Yeah.
Everybody didn't get to see the dog earlier. But Bob is the director of the Center for Human Learning, and he's the Marlene and Morton Meyerson Centennial Professor in Music and Human Learning. The way I got to know him, besides he's a neighbor, is that he holds a clinical professorship at the Dell Medical School. And in particular has been important for us in exploring the pitfalls of giving up when you don't succeed. So the other thing that you would want to know about Bob Duke, if you've ever been driving home on Fridays, or maybe into work, I guess it is, and you've heard two guys on your head, this is one of those guys.
There you go.
So if he says something of interest here, you can always get his podcast from KUT and other NPR stations. And in fact, I used one just the other day, Bob, the one on well, I don't know how to say this one, the bad news about the feedback sandwich.
Oh, yeah. There you go. Nicely put. Yeah. You did that very delicately, Luann. That's good.
Yes. It is great fun. And when you're trying to get us to think about new ways of doing things, it was a great stimulus. So with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Thanks, Luann. Thank you all for coming today. I'm very happy to get to talk to you about things that I think a lot about and study in my lab, and that I'm very interested in, and I hope will be interesting to you, which is how we human beings learn and develop skills. You know, I think one of the things, whenever I talk to medical school faculty, a question that comes up often is, how do I get my students to open up and just try things and venture an answer when they're not absolutely sure of the right answer, or they're not sure what they're supposed to do? And I think, you know, all of us have experienced this if we work with students of any kind, but I think particularly medical students who, when they're undergraduates in college, are trying to get into medical school. And as a result of that, they work really hard to get the highest possible grades they can get. And in doing so, they become tremendously averse to mistake making. Because mistake making is associated with a lower grade, and what comes about as a part of their education is they learn, understandably. By the way, this isn't a maladaptive response. This is an adaptive response. Whatever you do, don't make a mistake, and you sure as hell shouldn't make a mistake out loud, right? And I think what that does is inhibits what people are actually able to learn, especially about complicated things like becoming a physician. And I think there are certainly impediments to teaching the way I'm going to talk about teaching today, because all of us know that our students have shelf exams and they have CME exams. They have all these kind of things that they have to do to pass that we didn't design, that are designed by somebody else or by committees at the national level. And we've got to get them ready to do that. And they want to know what the right answer is. So when someone asks me this question, what do I say? And I think that's a challenge for us, is to create an environment, and multiple environments for that matter, where students are willing to try things out when they're not quite sure what they're supposed to be doing. And there's I from time to time get asked to give commencement addresses. And one of my favorite titles that I use is, what do I do when I don't know what I'm doing? And what many good students, and I use that term advisedly, learn is what I don't know what I was what I don't know what I'm doing, I should stop and wait until somebody explains something to me, and then I should go ahead and do what I'm doing. So anyway, to kind of frame this discussion, I'm going to show you a short little video. It's just a couple of seconds long, but I just love to look at it, so I'm going to let you look at it as well. And let's see if I can get my slide thing to do this correctly. Let's see. There we go. Okay, can all of you see this? So I'm going to show you a slide of a little baby being a little baby, and we'll talk about this after it's over. Here we go. Now, if you're not touched by that, you have no soul. What's interesting about that is that's why our species has thrived, because we know how to do that. And what we learn when we learn the most is we recognize the relationship between the things that we do and the consequences that come about as a result of what we do. And that takes time and experiences to do that. And when you're in a situation like medical education, and I've got this, ton of stuff I need to get students to know. And by know, I mean, when they're asked a question, they say the right answer in response to that question. I feel like I don't have any time to do what that baby was doing. I don't have any time for fumbling around and muddling and just watching and seeing what happens when I do this and what happens if I take this thing and I do another thing to it. We don't have time for that. But what I hope I can convince you of today, we don't have time not to do that, because that's what develops understanding. What I think many people don't recognize is that getting the right answer is a poor indicator of understanding. It's just the right answer. And there's a wonderful little construction that Daniel Dennett, the philosopher who was at Tufts University, really quite an interesting guy, came up with. And he differentiates between competence and comprehension, and notes the fact that it's possible for someone to become competent in the sense that they can do a particular thing in a particular context without really having to understand what it is they're doing. And this happens all the time, because in all levels of education, we have a goal of trying to help people get to the right answer as efficiently and quickly as possible. And in doing that, we try to strip away all the opportunities for mistake making that they're likely to make. And then in so doing, we're going to get them to the right answer, and they're going to be happy because they didn't make mistakes, and we're going to be happy because they didn't make mistakes. Except the problem is they don't really have to understand what they're doing. And I'll show you an example that I use as an example of this all the time. And it's this problem. This is one mathematics problem, which all of us have seen sometime in school. And if I asked you to solve this equation for X, some of you might have to dust out some cobwebs, but most of you would be able to do that. But I just want to tell you just an experience, just to kind of illustrate how pervasive this is. For about 23 years at Texas, I would give the opening talk on teaching for all the new faculty hired on the main campus. So be new faculty orientation, the president would come and say, welcome to Texas, and teach everybody to do that, and where to buy orange clothes. And then I'd give a talk about teaching. And I'd put that slide up somewhere in my talk. And I say, somebody raise your hand and tell me what the answer is. And like, nobody raised their hand. except 5 people in the math department. And I would ask these 150 PhDs who are sitting in front of me, why the hell aren't you raising your hand? And what I ask them to think about, for the same reason that your students don't raise their hands when you ask a question. Because like, what if it's a trick? You know, what if I don't really understand the problem? And what if I raise my hand and he called on me and I said 3/8? He said, well, it's not 3/8 because it's not 3/8. What then? Well, nothing. But you know the emotional impact in a room full of that many people where you raise your hand and volunteer to answer and you got it wrong, right? It would be incredible, right? Now, after I get past that part and somebody finally says it's 1.5 or 6/4, I say, okay, so how'd you get that? How'd you get from there to 1.5 or 6/4? And most people make a gesture like this. This is the universal gesture for that problem. And what they're saying is I flip this thing over and 2/1, then I multiply across and get 6/4, and then I reduce the fraction, I get 1.5. Okay. Now, the question I ask is, what? Whoops, didn't mean to do that. The question I ask is, why do you do that? Why do you flip that over? And now people don't raise their hand, not because they're afraid of making a mistake. They have no idea, right? And the best answer I ever got for that, I was in a room full of 5th graders once, and I put that problem, I wrote it on the blackboard, and I said, why do you invert the divisor? And because that term was called the divisor. And this kid in the front row raised his hand and said, if you don't, you get it wrong. What better rationale does somebody need for doing something, you know? But I want to tell you, the rationale for inverting the divisor is the only interesting thing about that equation. And if you don't understand that, you don't understand anything interesting about that equation. But here's the thing. If the goal of a teacher or a school or an institution or a society is to get rooms full of disparate children all getting the right answer for that equation, one way to do it is put lots of problems on a piece of paper like that with different numbers in them and teach everybody to go invert and multiply, invert and multiply, invert and multiply. And you'll get rooms full of people all getting the right answer without any commensurate requirement that anybody knows what the hell they're doing. Because you don't have to. You just have to get the answer. Now, one of the challenges for me as a teacher when I work with my new doctoral students is to disabuse them of the thought that because I know the right thing to say when somebody asks me the question in the way that I've learned to answer it, I understand something, right? And not in a way I want to disabuse them that so they feel bad about themselves, but that then they start to think differently about what it means to be competent and what it means to learn. And that's a challenge because there's an emotional thing associated with this, right? Because the thing is, making a mistake is not devoid of emotional valence. You know, nobody likes to get something wrong, but that's the way brains are cooked to learn. And I think one of the challenges that we face, and I'm convinced that medical schools can be the people who fix this, is to actually teach the neuroscience of why mistake making contributes to productive memories. It blows my mind that we don't talk about that. I mean, it's a medical school. We're supposed to know how bodies work and all that kind of stuff. And the mistakes that medical students have, their misconceptions about mistake making are because they fundamentally don't understand how their own brains work, right? They can identify the cranial nerves and they know where the amygdala are and they can do all that kind of stuff, but they don't understand how the damn thing works. Because if they did, they wouldn't study like they study, right? They study like they study because they stare at stuff they're supposed to be learning and they look at it over and over and over and over again, and then they look away and see if they can recall it and do it over again. And they think, I know it. No, you don't. You can recall it. That's good, but that's not really what understanding is about. Right. I mean, the understanding part is harder. So I'm gonna practice what I preach right now. And I don't know who's controlling the breakout rooms here. Do we know who that is? Who the breakout room controller is?
That would be me.
That would be you, Dorothy.
Yeah.
Okay. So would you create random breakout rooms with 3 people in a room?
Yeah.
And I'm not going to go in a room. And here's your assignment, right? What is it about making a mistake when you're developing a skill or developing understanding? What actually happens in the brain when a mistake is made? And what features have to be in a mistake-making environment that actually leads to a productive outcome? Okay, is that vague enough? I mean it to be vague. So I'm going to give you 4 minutes. No, I'll give you 5 minutes to talk about that with each other. I'm going to stay out. Although if this was my house and I was controlling the thing, I would hop around in different rooms, but I'm not going to do that. And I'm not going to ask Dorothy to do that for me. And so I'll give you 5 minutes to talk about this. And when we come back, I want somebody to say some stuff. And if you think, I'm not sure I understand this, good. But see what you can make of that idea, because it's not completely out of the realm of possibility that you could understand this. Okay. All right, Dorothy.
Is there a way that you can put the questions again, like on the chat box? So as we.
Sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I can try.
I think somebody else just mentioned that in the chat box.
Okay, great.
It is a long question.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
I'm
it
afraid
is.
I'm afraid when we go to the rooms, you might not be able to see the chat, but we should try it and see what
Yeah.
happens.
Well, actually, in my Zoom, I can actually broadcast to the chats, but I don't.
Yes.
Maybe Dorothy can do that too.
I can try.
Okay, there's the short version of my long-winded question. Now, here's the thing, and I mean this with love. I don't expect all of you to know the answer to this, but I want you to come up with what seems like a reasonable answer. Okay?
And when you say changes in memory, you mean you were talking about learning before, right?
Yeah,
That's what
Yeah,
you mean.
well, that's
Okay.
what learning is, right? Yeah, it's changing memory. Okay, happy trails. Get out. See ya. Thanks, Bill. You'd think after all these years I'd finally have the mute button down, but apparently not. Mistakes. But here's the thing. Just as I was sort of eavesdropping on people, different people have different emphases in how they're thinking about this, and what might be the advantages or not of making a mistake. And so we're not going to take the time to kind of report out and share what everybody came up with, because I'm not really concerned with whether anybody got it right or not. But I want to show you the results of an experiment. And I'd like you to see if, based on what you were just talking about, if you can explain the results of this experiment for a minute. So here's the thing. So people were asked to remember a word association. So they were learning pairs of words. And in one condition, they were shown the word, and the word was something that was in a category that they could decide what the word is. And in another condition, they were just shown the stem of a word, like a couple of letters, and then asked to guess. So I'm going to show you the whole experiment here. So here's the thing. So the prompt in one condition, people were giving that prompt, and they were said, okay, what's the word? And they would guess. Now, of course, it could be, I just wrote 4 possibilities. There are many more than that could be, right? And we compared people, I say we, not, this wasn't my study, but the authors of the study compared people who used this technique to learn the words with people who saw what the correct word was, which in this case was bracket, right? And what I'm going to show you in this graph is how these people did. And they had younger subjects, which are much younger than I, and then older subjects. And unfortunately, I would be in the older group here. And what they're showing is the black line is the people who were shown the BR and bracket. And the gray lines are the people who were said BR, they had to guess, and were then shown the correct word, which was bracket. So they've all made mistakes, right? Now, what I'd like you to see here is that the people who made mistakes did worse when they were asked to recall this a week later than the people who were shown the correct answer. Right now, I sound like I'm talking out of 2 sides of my mouth here, because I just said mistakes are good. And why would this condition produce a worse outcome? But now I'm going to show you another condition where the prompt wasn't the stem of a word, but it was flower. And then people thought about, well, what flowers could it be? And now here's a bunch of flowers that it could be. And in this instance, the correct answer was daffodil in this answer. But now I want to show you the results of these. And in these, the people who guessed and were then shown the correct answer all did better on the retention test a week later. Now, I'm going to ask you to speculate, why would that be? Why would this instance not lead to a better retention of the memory, but this one did? Anybody have any thoughts about that? I'm going to ask Barbara not to Google it, because when I went into Barbara's group, she Googled what I was asking. So I always tell students no Googling. So anyway, anybody have any thoughts about this, about why that might be?
I do. It might be because it allows you to have a concept, a picture in your mind about the word. So you're able to conceptualize it rather differently than if you got just BR. It's just doesn't mean very much.
Exactly. I mean, we know that what we think of as a memory, right? The engram, the memory trace for anything we think of as a memory, is not a neuron, right? It's a constellation of neurons, most of which are connected to other memory traces, right? So it's not just one thing. So daffodil is connected to rose, is connected to iris, connected to chrysanthemum, all connected to flower, which may be connected to plants, which may be connected to gardens, which may be connected to corsages. I won't go on, but you get the idea. All that stuff is profusely interconnected. So when I say BR, right, as Adela is saying, when I say BR and you just have to guess something, there are no networks in your brain that are activated except the lexical things of a letter B and a letter R and the sound that makes. When I say flower, now I've activated potentially this network of memories in your head, which now gets you ready to learn what the correct thing is, right? Isn't that fascinating? It's just such a cool thing to think about. Now, I want to show you something that to me is really important when we're thinking about how we're preparing students to do this kind of thing. And it's this. If you want to cross-stitch something on a pillow so you remember it all the time, this is the one thing to remember. Brains are prediction machines. I mean, a typical human brain represents about 3% of body weight in a normal adult. It uses about 20 to 25% of our daily energy. I mean, that's an expensive thing to run. And you could ask the question, why would evolution make a brain? I mean, something that's that expensive, right? Because for billions of years on the earth, there were single-celled organisms that were living quite happily. Well, I don't know how happy they were, but they were living on earth without any nervous system, let alone a brain. So why a brain? And there's only one really good evolutionary reason to have a brain. And that's brains allow you to predict what's about to happen. That's what brains are for. That's what memories are for. Because if I can predict what's about to happen, I'm better able to catch prey. I'm better able to keep from becoming prey. I'm better able to attract a mate if I'm able to predict what's about to happen. So that's what our brains are doing all the time. They're predicting what's about to happen. Now, I'll tell you what doesn't happen. If I walk into a classroom and a teacher who's a very good explainer, and I'm a really good explainer, and I explain something to you and you understand it, you think, okay, I understand it, but you didn't do anything except listen. You didn't predict anything. You didn't make any mistakes. You just listened to my lucid explanation of the way things are. And I've had many students come up to me after one of my lucid explanations and say, Dr. Duke, I understood everything you said. I understand it now. And my response to them is, no, you don't. You just watched me understand it. And when you'll know whether you understand it or not is after you've left this room. And first of all, if you can reconstruct my explanation, that's the first level. And then can you generalize that explanation to something else that I didn't even talk about? And if you can do that, then maybe you're starting to understand it. But just remembering what I said or being able to understand what I said is not a measure of understanding. So I'm going to tell you how we know this, which is a fascinating thing about how we understand about how brains work. All of you understand, I know back in your neuroscience classes that memories can be classified into so-called declarative and so-called procedural memories, right? Procedures are things that we know how to do, things that we can't necessarily articulate in language. So as Bill was saying, you're in a small group, like riding a bicycle is a procedural memory, right? We know how to do it. I can't really tell you what I'm doing with my center of gravity and while I'm keeping the bike upright, but my brain knows how to do it, right? So there's memory in there. It's just not memory that can be verbalized. But if I'm going to reach for the glass here in front of my computer on my desk here, right? I send a motor command to the parts of my body that are going to be involved in picking up this glass. And of course, where I'm sitting has something to do with what body parts are going to be involved. If the glass was down at the end of my desk, I'd have to get up out of my chair and I'd have to walk over there. There'd be all these other things involved, right? So it's not just the relevant parts. It's everything that might be necessary to complete that task that I want to do. But what we don't recognize, because this happens quite unconsciously, is our brains also send a model, a forward model, which is sometimes called an efference copy. That's just lingo you don't need to remember. But what that model does is it creates a prediction about when my hand starts to move to reach this glass, what's supposed to happen? Like, how heavy is the glass? How much am I going to have to contract this muscle to get it off the table into my mouth? So my brain's making predictions about this all the time. And of course, once I start to move toward the glass, I'm getting actual sensory feedback from my body and my sense receptors about what's actually going on. And what my brain is doing, again, quite unconsciously and really fast, is it's comparing the predictions to the outcomes. And it's asking the question, do the predictions match the outcome or do they not match? And here's the thing, the mismatch is what teaches my brain to update the memory. Now, I'll tell you an interesting thing that is sort of, kind of illustrates this point. If you fly to a new city that you're unfamiliar with, and you have a friend who lives there, and you meet your friend at the airport, and your friend says, hey, would you mind driving? Because I've got to do some things on my phone here. So would you mind driving to the restaurant? I'll tell you how to get there. And your friend's in the passenger seat and you're driving, and your friend says, okay, take this exit here. You got the exit. Go to the second light and turn left, and you turn left. And then go down 2 blocks, then turn right, and turn right. And you go about a half a mile, and you turn left, and the parking lot's on the left, and you turn in the parking lot to the restaurant. And you get to the restaurant errorlessly because your friend knows the city and knows how to get to the restaurant. If I put you back in the car, back at the airport, and said, find the restaurant, especially if I did it a day later, you wouldn't find the restaurant. Why? Because there was no opportunity to make a mistake. And the fact that you didn't have an opportunity to make a mistake means that your brain wasn't paying attention like it would be paying attention if you were having to make decisions, right? And here's the thing, when a really good teacher gives a really clear explanation to a student, and the student doesn't have to make any decisions and doesn't make any mistakes, and the teacher and the student, unfortunately, think, okay, I've got this now, that's a mistake. Now, I want to tell you something about my choice of language, because I'm very deliberate about my choice of language. You notice what I'm not saying. I have not yet used the word failure till right now. When we use the word failure, it's so catastrophic, and people talk about productive failure. Nobody wants to fail. I mean, it's just, and if I make a mistake, I haven't failed. I just made a mistake. You know what I mean? And I think what's interesting to me is how students have taken on this weight of mistakes. Like, I failed, I got the wrong answer. We got to stop that. And one of the ways to stop it is to change our language about it. When I talk to people about mistake making, I really avoid the word failure because it's just too catastrophic. And we're not talking about a catastrophe. We're just talking about mistake making. Okay, I'm going to show you just a couple more things, and then I'm going to shut up and we'll talk about something else. One of the things I want to say about that prediction error thing is that if there's not an opportunity to make a prediction, then your brain is not going to have a chance to recognize the dissonances between the prediction and the outcome. And it's recognizing those dissonances which lead to changes in neuronal structure. What also medical students don't quite get, even after the blindingly fast trip through medical neuroscience we do here at Texas, medical neuroscience in 4 weeks. Are you kidding me? Anyway, they go through this really fast. And what they don't really get is that in order to form a memory, brains have to grow new stuff, right? Because most people use computer memory as a metaphor for organic memory, and it ain't, right? If I'm working on my computer and I decide to save something and I hit the save command, a bunch of binary switches flip from 1 to 0 to 0 to 1 in some configuration that represents the stuff that I saved. My brain puts a tag on it. And so if I go back to my computer later that evening or later that week or even later that year, barring some malfunction or some physical catastrophe in my computer, what I put there will be just like it was when I left it. That's not the way organic brains work at all. right? What all of you are doing right now, who are paying attention to this call, and all of you, thank you for seeming like you're paying attention, is that while you're doing that, what your brains are doing right now, because you've already got memories in your brains, is your brains are trying to figure out how does what's happening right now relate to stuff that's already in there. So even though we're all on the same call, you're all listening to me talk and looking at my slides, every one of you right now is having a different experience than the person sitting in the square next to you, because you brought different stuff with you to the table, because there's different memories in your head. And what happens after this is going to influence what you do and don't remember, and how well you remember, and the fidelity of your memory after this thing is over, because you've got different stuff in your head. So the idea that if I bring a bunch of people in a room and I all subject them to the same thing, whether it's a fascinating lecture by me or something else, and I walk out thinking, okay, they've all had the same experience. They have not had the same experience, because they are not the same people. And they are not the same suites of memories. So they're not experiencing what I'm doing exactly alike. And if I don't take account of that, then I'm missing the boat. I'm missing opportunities to teach more effectively, because I'm assuming what I give is what they get. And no, what they get is what they get. And often it's consistent with what I give. Sometimes it's not even close. And it's not my fault. It's not their fault. It's just the fact that they got different memories in their head than I've got in my head, right? So what's the solution to that? I have to have learners generate more on their own in my presence, right? The reason I sent you off to go talk a little bit about this is to generate things on your own. What teaches brains it's time to grow new stuff is a learner generating stuff on her own or his own. Sitting there and listening, there's no signal to the brain to do anything. And we all know through a typical waking day, we forget most of everything that we experience. And that's not a bug, that's a feature, right? There'd be no reason to remembering everything that happens to us every day. So the question you have to ask as a teacher is, what's going to signal the brains of my students' heads not to forget this one? And it's not what you're doing right now, because you're not busy enough to be learning, right? When you were learning is when you were off in the room talking to each other. That was the learning part. This isn't learning. This is just listen to Bob talk, which is delightful, but it's not teaching you anything, right? The teaching part happens when you're on your own and generating stuff on your own. That's when the teaching happens. Okay, I'm gonna leave you one more thing, and then we can do whatever Luann wants me to do with you. Okay, this is another problem. And here's what I'd like you to do. So I'm going to explain to you what we're looking at here. So I've got 9 identical 2-inch cubes. They're identical in every way. They're sealed. You can't get into them. They look the same. They feel the same. And wadded up in one of those 2-inch cubes is a $100 bill. And wadded up in the other 8 cubes is a blank piece of paper the size of a $100 bill. Now, in my hypothetical scenario here, if you can find the $100 bill, you get to keep it. Well, you might say, well, Bob, how can I find the $100 bill? The cubes are sealed. I can't open them. How do you expect me to find the cubes? Well, I'll give you a hint. The $100 bill paper, I mean, the real legal tender paper, is just a little heavier than the blank pieces of paper. But the difference is so slight, your motor system couldn't detect it. If I had the $100 bill cube in this hand and a blank piece of paper cube in this hand, I couldn't feel the difference by feel. So to help you, I'm going to give you a balance scale to find the cube with the $100 bill, right? Which is a little bit heavier than the other cubes. And balance scales goes, there are many numbers on it. It just tells you which side of the scale has more mass on it than the other. But here's what's make this a puzzle, right? You can only use the scale twice. So you can put some stuff on the scale and see what happens. You can put some stuff on the scale and see what happens again, and that's it. You can't use the scale anymore. Now, this is a solvable problem. You can determine in 2 uses of the scale to a certainty which cube has a $100 bill. This isn't a trick. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to wait for a full minute and let you think about that. And Barbara's not going to Google it. And I want you to think about how you can find the $100 bill to a certainty in 2 weighings on the scale. Some people might have help. Some people like to draw it out and kind of see it, but I'm going to wait for a full minute before I say anything again. So here we go. Okay, it's been a minute. Now, here's the thing. I have to say this. I use this problem a lot too. But as I'm looking around the screen, for those of you who have your cameras on, as I was explaining the problem, some of you had a look on your face like, I bet I can solve that. And others of you had a look on a face like, I don't know if I can solve that. And others of you look like, this is stupid. I'm not going to try and solve that. So every class is here, right? Every student from all our classes are here. Now, here's the thing. If you tried to solve it and you didn't solve it, you really want me to tell you what the answer is right now. And if you did solve it, or you know what the problem is, you really want to tell somebody who doesn't know what the answer is. Now, I'm going to give you a recipe for joy. Don't do that. Just wait. If you don't know the answer, think about it later. Work on it later. And if you know the answer, don't wreck it for your friend. Just let them figure it out. And the thing is, I was giving a talk to her, I don't know, an auditorium full of public school teachers one time, and I put this slide up there, and I'm getting ready to move on to the next slide, and this teacher raised her hand, said, wait a minute, before you move, what's the answer to the Q problem? I said, I'm not going to tell you. She was pissed. Like, what do you mean you're not going to tell me? This is school. You give me a problem and I work on it, and then you tell me the answer, right? Why? And I'll tell you one other anecdote about this slide. So I was giving a talk on learning at the University of Glasgow in Scotland. And I was a plenary lecturer, and the first thing in the morning, I gave a talk, I showed this slide. At the end of the day, wine and cheese thing at the end of the day, these 4 students walk up to me, these 4 graduate students, a male and 3 emails. And the guy says, okay, what's the answer to the Q problem? So I'm not going to tell you. He said, look, man, I haven't thought about another thing all day. I'm just trying to solve this damn problem. What's the answer to the Q problem? I said, I'm not going to tell you. I said, but I'll ask you questions about it. What if you just put 1 cube on each side? He said, well, that's stupid. I mean, I said, wait a minute, don't go through that too fast. And before I could get to the second question, one of his friends, who I later learned her name was Gemma, lovely Scottish name, Gemma goes, I got it. Now, I could not give that to Gemma. Right? There is no lucid explanation from me that would do that for Gemma, right? But what it required was time and patience. And I know whenever I talk to medical faculty, they say, easy for you to say, buddy, because I got step exams coming up in a couple of weeks, and I ain't got time, and the students don't have any patience. So how about, but I'm not saying, we can only do that. We can do this for everything that we have to teach. But this should be a part of many aspects of students' learning experiences, that they have opportunities to spend a little time not quite knowing what to do. Because you know what? That's what physicians do all the time, right? I mean, people face difficult cases where the diagnosis and the treatment are not clear. And one of the ways that people learn to be good at that is by practicing that, right? I mean, students' mistaken belief is, when I'm really well educated, I will just know what to do all the time. Well, maybe sometimes, but not all the time, right? And I know that examinations are unforgiving when it comes to this kind of thing. There is no credit for a good idea that's reasonably wrong on a step exam, right? But I mean, from my shoes, there should be, because what really allows people to deepen their understanding of what they're doing. And this is something that Bill was saying in the small group about learning on a bicycle, is being able to do a little stuff with it that lets you find out what happens if I do this, and what happens if I do this other thing, and what would happen if this happened, you know, and now I've got a whole different thing going on. Okay, I'm gonna stop and see if Luann wants me to do something else, or what do you want to do, Luann? You invited me to this party. Don't let me blow it.
Well, our group is fairly small. Maybe we could just have some questions and answers for our last 10 minutes, or is that okay?
Yeah, it's good with me. Yes, Ellen. You're still muted, Helen.
There we go. So I have a question. Is it necessary to make a mistake, or is it only necessary to have thought about it for yourself?
Actually, it's not necessary to make a mistake, but it's advantageous to make a mistake.
Okay.
I mean, obviously we learn a lot of things in our life experience that weren't a result of correcting a mistake, right? I mean, we are capable of learning things like that. But what happens in that prediction thing, the neurotransmitter dopamine is a teaching signal, right? And what happens when we experience reward, whether that reward is getting the right answer or a food reward or whatever, right? If there was only a dopamine release at the time of the reward, we would never learn anything, right? So what our brain does is it learns what precedes the reward. And the dopamine signal is no longer at the onset of the reward, it's at the onset of the prediction signal, right? And if I haven't ventured a guess, not just a wild guess, but an educated guess, I haven't made a prediction. And the fact that I haven't made a prediction is going to reduce the extent of dopamine. In fact, it was really interesting. There was a study that just came out that we just talked in Journal Club in my lab this week or last Friday, I guess, about the relationship between effort and what happens in reward prediction error. And actually, effort increases the release of dopamine in reward prediction error. That's one thing. Increases the release of dopamine. The second thing, which is really not intuitive, is that when you're engaged in whatever the activity is, the maximum release of dopamine is when the reward is least certain. Now, that is like the most non-intuitive thing you can imagine, but actually that's true, right? Is that, and you can think about, again, evolutionarily, why would that be a thing, right? Well, because when I want to really remember something was when I expected this and that happened instead. And my brain says, "Bud, don't forget that one because you thought this was going to happen and this other thing happened," right? So it really is advantageous just to try. You know, again, not blindly guessing like you have BR and a blank, but you have flower and you start naming out your flowers, and now your brain is active in a way that when you get the correct answer, you're in a different place.
So you
Hey,
have
Kim. I'm sorry, Ellen.
No, I was just going to say, and I mentioned this in this small group, I mostly teach graduate students. I don't teach medical students. And the way I approach test giving, or we have problem sets with that they do along with us in the class, whatever, is to start out by saying there's not only one right answer. I want you to design an experiment to do such and such.
Yeah.
So there's thinking through it. I'm happier when they come up with an experiment that will work, but they're often different.
Yeah.
Well, I guess that's where I was going. I mean, that's still going to activate multiple networks that then tie together and pull on, synthesize information they've gotten in some other venue, one hopes anyway. So I think that would be in that case, but maybe not in teaching medical students where more often there is only one right answer, I suspect.
Well, I think the thing is, you know, the competence and comprehension thing, if you know what the right answer is, but you don't know why that's the right answer, I think your ability to use that information is pretty limited. Whenever I talk to people, I'm in a couple of grants that National Science Foundation is funding about science education. And from my view, science education ought to be science history education. Meaning, don't just tell me that, 3 codons code for this amino acid. How did somebody figure that out? What kind of experiments does somebody have to do to figure out how the bases in DNA code for amino acids? How'd that happen? Because if you hear that story, first of all, it's now a story, which makes it more memorable because we're human beings and we love stories. That's how we understand the world, is through stories, right? And now I have so much, a much richer network of connectivity with that memory than just knowing, these 3 make a guanine, and these 3, whatever the hell the thing is, Kim, did I wait too long before I called on you? You put your yellow hand down.
Oh, because sometimes when I don't do that, I keep my hand raised for the rest of the talk. So, so love the talk. And, no one who knows me is going to be surprised that I'm going to ask about multiple choice questions in this context, because I think that what we were just talking about, the idea that there's one right answer, which in my experience in medicine is it's not very often the case that there's one right answer. And most of the time there's multiple things that you need to be thinking about or doing at the same time. And yet we do so much of our assessment in this context where there is one right answer.
Yeah.
And I spend a lot of my time trying, I know I'm never going to convince medical students not to use multiple choice questions because that's how they get tested. But I'd be interested in, your thoughts on how to get the most out of the multiple choice questions when they are unfortunately being used, as sometimes a primary learning source. So you end up getting a little sound bite from this question and a little sound bite from that question. And, I try to get them to tell a story to connect it. But is there any other best practices out there around using multiple choice questions for learning that maybe we don't know about?
Well, I don't know any that are well tested and documented, but I'll tell you a couple of just ideas I have about this, right? I mean, when we give a multiple choice test, we are sampling knowledge, right? And we're making inferences that if you can get these questions right, then you probably know this other stuff, because we're not sampling everything, right? I mean, we're sampling. And what that does is it rivets students' attention on what's going to be on the sample and not all the other stuff that's not going to get sampled, right? So my thought, if we were stuck with multiple choice questions and we have to do this, right? In the practice experiences we have in class, there would be a multiple choice question that students would answer and then explain their answer, or explain why one of the distractors is a distractor and not the right answer, right? But here's the thing, and this is a tough nut to crack, is that you have to do that when grades aren't riding on it. I mean, the thing is, when I write a grant that doesn't get funded on the first submission, no one lowers my academic rank and no one docks my salary. I edit the grant and resubmit it, But the thing is, when you're in school, every damn thing you do that gets feedback has a grade associated with it. And so you are not receptive to negative feedback, right? If I give somebody a B on a paper and they want to come to my office hour and talk to me about their paper, and I want to show them how to build a better constructed paragraph, that's my agenda. Their agenda is to convince me that their paper is really better than I think it is, and they should have a higher grade. So we're not even on the same page, right? And one way you break that apart is to separate feedback with a grade and feedback that's just feedback, right? Because if you think about it, how often do we give feedback to people? I mean, meaningful feedback that helps them correct what they're thinking that's not associated with a grade, right? I mean, to me,
I would argue that's not possible in clinical education.
Could be.
Because you're working while you're learning. So everything you do is part of how you get assessed.
Yeah.
Like it's literally not possible. I'd love to hear someone on the call tell me otherwise, because maybe I'm not seeing it this way, but like it's
You're getting a lot of
inseparable.
agreement. So yeah.
Okay.
But I think, Bob, the idea of using test, the kind they have to take, for other kinds of purposes, predicting whether the certainty of your answer or why, I think we've taught them to do that, and they're using test as a study tool.
Mhm. Great.
So I like the idea of bringing that into the classroom as helping them predict in your presence.
You know, I would tell you what I do when I give an exam in class, which I don't give many, but when I do give the exam, everybody fills out the exam as the exam. They turn it in. I don't grade it. We come back the next day. I hand out everybody's exam, and I hadn't talked to each other about their answers. And I say, well, and when there's a discrepancy, now there are all these discussions ensue. Well, you put that, and I put this, and now that discussion would never happen if I just gave them a topic and said, talk about that, right? They did that because what the exam revealed are discrepant points of view that now they have something to talk about, that they're motivated to talk about, you know?
Yeah. Well, all right. Unfortunately, we are out of time. But
Thank you.
thank you for stimulating our predictions and hopefully some experimentation, as Ellen had suggested. And well, what else could we do? So
Well, listen, it's been a real pleasure, and Luann, thank you so much, and thank all of you for spending your lunchtime with me. I hope we'll have a chance to meet in person sometime. But in the meantime, good luck. Thanks.
Okay, we have another roundtable scheduled in January. You'll be hearing about it at that point. So if you have a particular topic that or person to suggest, feel free to reach out to me. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks everybody. Thanks,
Thank
Dorothy.
you, Luann. Bye-bye.